know that you're discharged. But if you just hang out for
Good afternoon. You have just seen closing arguments in the case of former Grand Rapids police officer Christopher Schurr. Schurr is charged with second-degree murder in the killing of Patrick Lyoya. Now, at this point, the jury has been instructed to deliberate amongst themselves and come back with a verdict which will decide Christopher Schurr's fate. Let's take a moment to break down what Schurr is charged with. Second-degree murder is defined as a death caused by an act of the defendant, that's Schurr in this case, with malice. Another element of second-degree murder is that the act causing the death is, quote, without justification or excuse, unquote. That element is part of what will be argued and was argued in this trial, as the State of Michigan Court of Appeals believed there was enough evidence for a jury to determine if Schurr was justified to kill Lyoya due to self-defense. This is a felony with up to life in prison as a punishment. Today, a lesser charge has also been offered to the jury, second-degree manslaughter. That fits into similar guidelines, but if convicted, would show that Schurr did not intend to kill Patrick, but rather did intend to cause great bodily harm, and the killing would have resulted from reckless and careless actions. Again, we are just now wrapping up court today. We were able to hear both closing arguments and the rebuttal from Prosecutor Becker. We first started with closing arguments from Prosecutor Becker, who essentially went through his argument, saying that this killing was not justified, hitting on points about whether or not what the juror saw today. He says that it's not a simple case. It's not a simple case of a bad guy versus a good guy. There are elements that are simple to this case, but it's not as simple as a bad guy versus a good guy. He talked about things like bringing up the taser, saying that someone simply having a taser, part of him, does not lead to someone being killed the way that Patrick Lyoya did. He also talked about deadly force, saying that someone having a taser and being inflicting with pain should not cause death for somebody. Let's bring in Riley Mack, and Cali Lichter, both inside the courthouse all day long. Ladies, we just heard the end of the closing arguments and the rebuttal. Kind of walk us through, what did we hear exactly?
Before we started, Lauren, I just want to say if you hear some noise in the background, there are some demonstrators across the street who have been here all week in support of both sides in this trial. I just wanted to say that if you're hearing anything right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we started this morning at about 9:20 a.m. The defense rested after about 12 witnesses. The prosecution had 8 witnesses at the start of this trial. And then we heard, closing arguments, and the prosecution really started by introducing Patrick Lyoya as a man, as a human being. He pointed out his family, who's in the audience of the courtroom. He said he admits, Patrick was not a saint, he says, but none of the crimes that he committed that day, not listening to the officer, resisting arrest, drunk driving, he says none of these deserved a death sentence. He said that he had to prove three things in this trial: that Schurr killed Lyoya, that he intended to, and that the killing was not justified. He said the first two, were proven right away through that video. The third one, he had to prove to the court, and he said that he did that through his expert witnesses, through all of the evidence that he's shown in this trial. He also said that Schurr went against GRPD policy. When he chased after Lyoya at the start of that traffic stop. He says that Schurr didn't know the risks. He didn't know if there were weapons inside that car. There was another passenger in the car. He went against policy by chasing after him and putting himself at risk for that. He also said there's no GRPD policy on tasers, that, we can't say that he followed what a reasonable GRPD officer would do because we don't know what that is. There's no GRPD policy on when to escalate from a taser to deadly force. He also said that Schurr made mistakes on that day. He said that he was chasing after Lyoya when he shouldn't have been and that he was outnumbered. But again, these mistakes that he made did not justify him shooting someone. We also learned that in Schurr's reports to the Michigan State Police after, the investigation took place, Schurr wrote that, Lyoya began to walk away, that he began to turn away, that he was moving his arms and legs in a way to get away. And, the Kent County prosecutor, Chris Becker, ultimately said, was Lyoya just trying to get away? Was he trying to take that taser so that Schurr didn't use the taser on him? He ultimately argued that these are not actions that would justify someone being shot. This sounds like a person who was trying to get away from police. Yeah, and he really ended in that argument by saying this is not what a reasonable officer would do. What do you think, Cali?
I mean, this whole entire case, Lauren, hinges on hindsight. You have both sides saying that these witnesses who the respective sides called in aren't commenting on hindsight. They are saying that the decision by the jury needs to be made in that moment. And you have a difference between the prosecution and the defense on, what was known at the time and what a reasonable officer, or in this case, Schurr, would have done. And then you have the defense saying that if any officer was in Schurr's shoes, and they even brought up, they called in a couple people on the force currently at GRPD, other former officers, and their point was like, you have all these former officers, current officers, captains who are coming in saying they would have made the same choices that day. They're not speaking in hindsight, they're speaking as almost this reasonable officer character, but you have the prosecution then, rebutting that and saying no reasonable officer would have done that if you take in the totality of the circumstances. That's another word that we've been hearing throughout the trial. The totality of the circumstances. What is everything that happened in that incident only? Looking at that incident, what should Schurr have known? What did Schurr know? And then what did he do based on his knowledge? And so again, the closing arguments that we saw couple of 30 minutes now, an hour. It was the last time that both the prosecution and the defense can really get their point across to the jury on what they believe went down that day.
Ladies, just before closing arguments, we heard that the second charge, manslaughter, was actually brought into what jurors can now decide on. Can you talk about that conversation of the defense not wanting manslaughter to be in, but then also that kind of back and forth between the defense's closing argument and the prosecution's rebuttal talking about manslaughter in this case?
Go ahead, please.
When it comes to, a voluntary manslaughter charge, that is the lesser charge that's kind of been referenced throughout this whole entire case. It's beyond a reasonable doubt or lesser charge. So the defense, through a motion, which was, I believe, talked about even before the trial started, they didn't want, this to be an option. They objected to having this as an option, or disagreed. Can't think of the word off the top of my head right now. But the defense didn't want this to be an option, and it comes down to they hope the jury finds their client, in this case Christopher Schurr, innocent. So they don't want, another option on the table. That's another thing that they have to, or I guess not defend against. Again, Schurr is innocent until proven guilty. The defense doesn't have to do anything. It's on the burden of the prosecution, to prove this case. But they don't want that other option when it comes to, they're here for the second-degree murder charge. They're kind of talking about, not having that as an option, but the judge disagreed. She said, she disagreed with the motion of the objection, and she's going to allow that to be an option that they could find, Schurr guilty on if it comes to it.
And the defense brought up in their closing arguments, they said that the prosecution introduced this charge because they believe that their case is weak. That's what the defense was saying in their closing arguments. And they both had different definitions of when this charge comes about. Really, it's just the excitement of the moment can create that deadly force situation. And that's certainly something that they've, the totality of the circumstances they've been speaking on, those sort of circumstances throughout the trial.
And ladies, I know that you had to rush down outside of the courthouse to talk to us. So if you were able to hear the judge start to go through the instructions of what the jurors have to decide on, can you talk about the evidence that they actually have to listen to? It that might not include what they actually heard. It has to be actually very concrete things they have to decide on.
Yeah, I mean, she spoke on jury questions. I know that was a big piece in the beginning of the trial that she said, the jury is allowed to ask questions. That's not always the case in the courtroom. She said that, the jury questions themselves are not evidence, just how the person answered those questions, I think she said. The specific witnesses, it was a very specific instructions on what can be admitted and what isn't.
And you know, they've been asked since the very beginning, and it was kind of reiterating these instructions, is that they can only listen to the evidence that's been used in this case, the witnesses who have appeared on the stand in the case. There's been so many things outside of this case that have been, you know, brought to light over the past 3 years, whether that's through news reporting, like reporters here at stations, newspapers, or just, you know, things that have been released by investigators, by detectives. But they're being asked, you know, to only consider what is being said in this case, in this moment. And again, it goes back to the totality of the circumstances. Yeah. When everything is considered, what the jury believes should be considered, because they were told that, you know, there are some times where you can choose not to believe a witness, or not at least, you know, think one witness is as credible as the others. So when it comes down to their opinion, piecing together what they believe to be the case and their final decision, they can only think about what's been said in that courtroom in front of them.
And ladies, there are people who are demonstrating behind you. It looks like it's a BLM flag flying behind you. Can you just maybe talk about what you all are seeing out there? Is there a large presence of people in support of both sides? What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a steady presence all week of people on both sides. I know that when we've arrived to the courthouse every single morning, you know, these groups kind of ebb and flow as the day goes on. But, you know, you have, I'm going to check behind me real quick and see who's out here. Over the past, I guess now it's been a week, because the trial started last Monday. You've had people out here with Black Lives Matter flags, posters, justice for Lyoya, and you've also had people on the other side, you know, waving thin blue line flags while they're out here, saying justice for Schurr. And there hasn't been a huge clash. You know, there's been some times where the groups have kind of met head to head on the sidewalk, but there's also a large law enforcement presence that's been here throughout the whole entire trial, even during jury selection when Riley and I were here for that. You know, making sure that everything is calm, staying under control. Nothing has, you know, necessarily gotten out of hand. It's people who are exercising their First Amendment right on both sides out here on the sidewalk in front of the courthouse.
Yeah.
And ladies, now that we've heard both opening arguments, closing arguments, you guys were both there for both arguments. Can you maybe talk about the comparison of how this trial started to now, how it's ending? Did the closing arguments kind of really connect to the opening arguments, or I guess any differences that you saw?
When it comes to the prosecution's closing argument, you know, it kind of started out the same way, you know, like one shot to the head. And it was really Becker and the prosecution, you know, through him, saying that this, in their belief, was unjustified. What started as a traffic stop over a license plate, over, you know, driving that kind of was out of the norm, you know, someone ended up dead. And so they were trying to reiterate to the jury that this was unjustified. And while there could be some justifiable actions during the incident, you know, there were things that were unjustified. And that's what they're really hinging on. And, you know, Becker went through his points, kind of bringing back, you know, witness testimony, reminding the jurors what they've heard over the past week, but also bringing back the points that he was trying to prove and the prosecution was trying to prove through this whole entire trial, you know, how this was unreasonable and unjustified. And he said that's really at the core of it, and kind of saying, you know, through Schurr's own statement, they brought up the Michigan State Police statement that was given around, I believe, 11 days after this incident happened. You know, what he said then versus what he was saying on the stand just last week. And kind of pointing out the differences in that, saying, you know, how can you say one thing and then say the other? And then how does that make that justified based on what was in this report and the responses to the questions that were asked by the Michigan State Police? So again, it really went back on this. It was unjustifiable for the situation to escalate from point A to point B, in their opinion, and was really trying to hit that home for the jury.
And I feel like on the defense's side, you know, they similarly kind of brought it full circle. At the beginning, Michaela Hamilton from the defense team spoke on, you know, more of a narrative perspective of Schurr's day that April 4th morning, how he woke up for work at 4 a.m. and he kissed his wife and his dog goodbye and he left for work to go protect the people of Grand Rapids. And they spoke on, you know, his job as a policeman is to arrest people who are breaking the law, which they said Lyoya did. They say he was doing his duty as a police officer to arrest him that day, to chase after him. And they really spoke on, more of the narrative side of that from Schurr's perspective, which we got a lot of during his testimony. Really that perspective of a police officer doing his job has been the kind of the narrative that they're trying to sell in the opening and closing statements.
And again, ladies, we know that now that there's a second-degree murder charge and a manslaughter charge that the jury does have to deliberate. Can you just once again, for people who maybe just tuned in, break down what the jury has to decide on for both of these charges for Schurr to be convicted of?
So you're going to have 12 jurors. There are 2 alternates. So all 14 were staying in the jury box throughout the duration of the trial, but then there are 2 jury members who are randomly selected to be alternates. They're not going to vote. So that's where you get the 12-person jury and the 2 alternates. And so, they're going to have to decide, reasonableness beyond, doubt, which is kind of what you're going with the second-degree murder charge. And then you also have the manslaughter charge. Was it lesser? Was there a lesser version of this shooting? That's basically what they're saying. If you can't prove one thing, can there at least be proof for another thing? I don't have the definition of voluntary manslaughter in front of me right now, but it's kind of that when they're speaking about that lesser charge, they're speaking of that manslaughter charge, which has now been brought into play.
And ladies, for people who maybe don't know, every day that we've seen something happen, we've always seen a lunch break happen at this hour. Can you just confirm to us, the jury is deliberating right now, correct? Or what is happening right now?
That's correct, yes. We kind of went through our lunch hour a little bit when we were closing those arguments. We were doing the rebuttal, but now the judge has broken it off. We are doing jury deliberations now, so it truthfully could be any moment when we come back with a decision.
Well, ladies, I appreciate you jumping in to kind of break down what we just heard. I know that you guys are itching to get back into that courthouse. Again, thank you so much for joining us.